Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our ongoing Tarot On classes, discussions, sharings, bedtime stories during the great global pandemic of 2020. I say global pandemic, it's by definition pandemic is pandemos, meaning all the people. So the global bit of that is a bit redundant. So each country is in various stages of lockdown. We're currently in our third week here in the UK of lockdown. So we've been sharing some videos as we've gone along. Cheers to Tony. I'm on water at the moment. But yes, definitely have a give. And one day perhaps we can organise a Guinness Fjord Order of the Hermits meetup in the real world. So today I'm going to be discussing Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot, and I'm going to be talking about some of the stories behind the book and some of the interesting things with the cards that actually you can use in your readings. Because obviously the Waite-Smith Tarot is one of the most influential tarot decks. The basic design concept hasn't been broken in the sense of the majority of cards follow the symbolic pattern laid out by the Waite-Smith Tarot, and very few deviate from that, and where they do, they haven't quite captured the popular imagination as the Waite-Smith Tarot. And so I wanted to discuss why I think that is from the research that Tolly Goodwin and I did for this book, Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot. I guess where we should start is the fact that Waite was a very devoted mystic, and he had a very, very profound and complex mystical philosophy that even though Aleister Crowley basically tarred him with a paintbrush as being boring and dry and using more words than he needed to, Waite's actual life story is really racy. He got up to a lot more than people might think from the outside, looking at a sort of waistcoated, Golden Dawn stuck-up sort of member in good standing. But also he had a very, very profound mystical approach, and he took his oaths seriously. He really did take those oaths seriously. And it wasn't until we really discovered the Waite-Trinic images, the second set of tarot that Waite actually developed 10 years after the Waite-Smith, that made these look like a sort of cartoon version of what he really had in mind. Thank you for the comments on the hair. I suddenly realised that watching these videos back in the future will be a sort of, whilst there have been various graphs throughout this pandemic, there's going to be a graph potentially of my descent into despair, madness, and long-hairedness. I might be able to rock the ponytail at some point. But when Waite had opportunity to do a deck that wouldn't be seen by anyone else, he really elevated it to the most sublime mystical level possible. And yet he managed to hide a lot of that in this deck. But today I wanted to start off by discussing what Pamela Colman Smith hid in plain sight. When we went to write this book, we had a very simple approach, a very simple philosophy, a very simple methodology, which was to place ourselves back in 1904. Well, actually 1908, 1909, and to not really have any sort of what's the word? what's it doing? Right, okay. To ignore everything that had been written about the Waite-Smith tarot entirely. We wanted to really place ourselves back at the beginning and look at it from the mindset of Waite and Smith at the time. And so we only used references that they would have had. We only use the music and the artwork and the books available and everything else around the time of 1908. And then we basically followed it up from there as to what would have been familiar with Pamela and what would have been known to Waite based on the historical research. And that's really where we came to the conclusion that at least, I think about 60% of the Waite-Smith deck is Shakespearean. At least another 20% is from other plays and stories that Pamela was familiar with, and particularly the minors this is. And then we have maybe 5 to 10% pulled from existing bits of artwork. Edward Burne-Jones's The Flower Book, and also what else? There was something else that has just escaped me at the moment. But anyhow, just pulling from different sources. Okay, so when we think about it at the time, we have a sort of Pamela Colman Smith was working for theatre design, and this is the sort of picture and the sort of costume that she would have been familiar with. Okay, so we can see this picture here. This is Oscar Ashe, and Oscar Ashe will turn up in our story a little bit later as well. So hello to Francis, good afternoon. Yes, I'm doing very well, thank you. And Victoria, I'm not really doing readings. We're just talking about the basis of the tarot in this session. We have an exchange group that you can join if you want to swap readings with other people. So here we have the sort of picture that would be familiar to Pamela at the time, and we can sort of see how that then translates into her cards. And I say her cards because I really do believe that Pamela had a lot to do with the design of the minor arcana, as we discuss in the book, and Waite had a lot to do with the major arcana. So I'd like to give one clear example first and then come back to talking about what this means. So this card here, okay? Now, for 100 years, people have been writing about this card from its first appearance in 1909 when the deck was first published. And Francis, I'm not doing readings today. We're just talking about the design of the tarot and the structure of the tarot today. So a lot of people have written about this card, and they've talked about the dress and the falcon and the hat, and some have mentioned the snail. And I went back to look at different books over the years in our collection, because we've got most of the books that have been published on tarot in the last 100 years. And different people have different ideas about what the snail is. Okay, so it's certainly the kept woman is one of the major themes, but I'm going to turn that on its head in a second because it's not quite that, and there's a reason for that. Now, when we look at the cards, we don't have Pamela's design notes. We don't know what was in her head at all when she designed these cards. But using Occam's razor, which is the simplest explanation, is usually the most accurate one, or the most likely one if you don't know the answer, we went with it's in Shakespeare. Basically, Pamela was designing these cards based on Shakespearean themes, things she was familiar with. Having thought that, we then thought, well, who gave her the design or the idea for each of the cards? And the simplest Occam's razor answer is that Waite slipped her a copy of a handwritten copy, it would have been, because it was before photocopiers, a copy of Book T. Now, Book T, as we mentioned before in some of the other videos, is a collection of meanings for the cards based on Kabbalah, held within the Golden Dawn. Now, the interesting thing is that Pamela was not of a high grade enough to have received that book. And this is why Waite plays it very coy when he says things like she was an exceptionally intuitive artist. And he even says in one place that he almost had to remove her from the influence of other people so that she could do the book, do the deck without picking up astral influences from other people. Now, basically, what Waite is doing in retrospect is, first of all, he's excusing the fact that he's given her Book T, this is our belief anyway, when he shouldn't have done, but it was the only thing she could have designed the cards from at the time. There wasn't other books on the tarot that she could have used. And the second thing is that she had moved to Small Hythe Cottage in Tenterden, to probably do a job sort of child minding and being with her friends Ellen Terry and Edie Craig and the rest of the Small Hythe gang, while she was drawing these cards. So she was out of the scene, out of the London scene, and she did have a set of instructions. But if members of the Golden Dawn, had have seen these cards, they would have almost certainly known that they were based on Book T, and we'll come on to why in a moment. And we have almost definite proof that some of these cards are based on their Book T descriptions. So the problem is that when we then look at these cards, we then have to refer to Pictorial Key to the Tarot, which is Waite's book that accompanied the deck. But in that book, Waite couldn't say what the cards were. He couldn't say what the minor cards were because he hadn't really seen them in detail. He hadn't really been bothered about them. He hadn't really worked on them. So in some cases, he misdescribes them. In one card, he says it could be pyramids or mountains in the background. He doesn't actually know because he didn't design them. In another card, he says that the figure is leaning on a staff. In fact, it's a hoe, like a farming hoe, and things like that. In the major cards, Waite almost certainly had a full hand in designing them, but in the minor cards, not so. So taking that, we then go and look at the influencers and imagine we are Pamela around the time, and she has been given Book T. She is used to designing what are called cabinet cards, which are basically usually they were very popular at the time. You used to collect them for actors and actresses, a bit like we saw Oscar Ashe. And they always had a figure, a prop, and a fence or a wall or a stage line to give a sense of perspective to the picture. So these are actually not stage cards. I know some people say that some of the cards have a stage line on them, like this card, for example. It has like a stage line. But actually, that isn't a stage line. They're not on a stage. This was a fairly common procedure for doing what are called cabinet cards. And cabinet cards were very popular at the time. Pamela would have been very familiar with them, and they always had a main figure or figures, a prop, a background, and then a sort of wall or a partition or a bed or some sort of fencing or anything else, which gave the card a sense of perspective, a depth to the card. And we see that in all of the cards. There's usually a character, a prop, and a background scene, and some sort of division in the card to give it a sense of perspective. So when we go and look at Shakespeare, then we find the snail is mentioned in Shakespeare. It's mentioned in a very particular scene in a very particular play. The play is As You Like It, and I'd like to read from Act 3, Scene 2. So here we go. So Rosalind, the main character of the play, As You Like It, says, "Nay, and you be so tardy, come no more in my sight. I had as lief be wooed of a snail." And Orlando replies, "Of a snail?" And she says, "Aye, of a snail, for though he comes slowly, he carries his house on his head. A better jointure, I think, than you make a woman. Besides, he brings his destiny with him." Orlando replies, "What's that?" "Why, horns, which such as you are fain to be beholding your wives for. But he comes armed in his fortune and prevents the slander of his wife." Okay, so what that basically is talking about is Rosalind is saying that she would rather be wooed as a snail, by a snail, than a man, because at least a snail has his own house, has his own property, and keeps his own independence. The other thing, the other joke in there about he brings his horns with him is a Shakespearean joke about cuckolding, which is sort of denigrating the other person in a particular way, and it was symbolized in Shakespeare's time by horns and in the play. And if you look really closely at the card, the detail is very important. We can see that Pamela has drawn two little horns on the snail as well to get that little bit of detail in. Okay, so the fact is that one might think, okay, well, there is a snail mentioned in Shakespeare and there's a snail on that card, but so what? What does that really prove in terms of this card? Well, it proves it when you know what Pamela Colman Smith was surrounded by, that she knew, and everything else. And here is Rosalind. Okay. And this is Rosalind as played around the same time as Pamela was doing this deck by a very famous actress, not Ellen Terry in this case, but Ada Rehan, an Irish actress. And she was very well known for certain things, and one of those was her black curly hair, very well known for that. And the dress, I don't know if you can see in the detail here, but it has, if you see there, can you see these roses that are painted on it? Okay. And so that is basically Rosalind at the time. And anyone looking at this deck, any of Pamela's friends and colleagues would have immediately recognized this as Ada Rehan playing Rosalind, and particularly because of the snail and because of the quote. And Rosalind is a very useful symbol for this card. So when we look at the book T description of this card and then look at Rosalind's character in the play, we can see that she is very discerning, very noble, very able to take advantage of her role, of her position, of her status, of her gender, of her relationship, of her family, and so on. She's a very independent, one of Shakespeare's finest characters, Rosalind, in As You Like It. So that snail then and that card represent a sort of independence more than the kept woman. I know we look at it as the kept woman in a sort of contemporary way, but that's only a contemporary interpretation of it. The problem with some of the cards that they have been moved over time away from their original meaning, their original interpretation, particularly as far as book T goes. And then other authors, other artists have then sort of taken what they projected into the card and passed it along. And so a little bit like we see the Two of Pentacles, for example, is more about miscommunication than it is about anything else. But modern authors have gone with the juggling of finances, work-life balance. But of course, back then, there was no such thing as a work-life balance to juggle. So it's quite interesting how these meanings have sort of expanded over time. And because Waite didn't write down anything specifically about the designs, and because Pamela Common-Smith didn't keep any notes as to her designs, then obviously everyone has been free to make their own interpretation, and that is something that has been sort of passed along, and partly why the cards are so useful for divination. They are useful for divination because people can interpret them in their own context. So yes, I would definitely go to book T. I do apologise if there are interruptions to the line or freezing. It may be in a moment. Definitely read book T as your guide to the cards. I would actually say read Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot as your guide to the cards, of course. But in this, we make the case that book T is probably the basis of the cards themselves. Now, let's take another look at one of the other cards and we'll see what we mean. So, not only did Pamela base her cards' minor designs on the Shakespearean elements, but she also based them on existing artwork that she'd already done for stories. So these three characters here on this card are very interesting. They're very specific. I always like the shock of hair on this character in the foreground, the shock of hair on the character in the foreground. And notice the cloak that this guy has got over his shoulder, and the sort of breeches that this character has got, and this jerkin that this character has got. They seem very specific, don't they? And yet no one really wrote about who these characters might be. And they're on a shoreline as well. That's very important. They're on a shoreline. It wasn't until we thought, well, Pamela had to do these in a rush, therefore she must have used existing artwork, that we found in the Book of Friendly Giants the three characters, and here they are. So you see the three characters here. You can see the cloak over the shoulder, the breeches and the jerkin, and so on. And they are all three very different characters. And these three characters are Dare and Do, Catch and Kill, and Fear and Fly. Dare and Do, Catch and Kill, and Fear and Fly. They're three pirates who hang out at the shoreline waiting for ships to get shipwrecked, and they get trapped by a giant into eventual servitude to the giant. But when I read this card now, I can read those characters as basically fight, flee, and freeze. So we have sort of freeze, flee, well, fight, freeze, and flee. So I often see this card, the Five of Swords, as the mind being in disruption, a bit like the internet connection is at the moment, and you having three choices. You can either run away, you can engage with it, or you can freeze in the middle. And you have these three options, and the mind really doesn't like that. And that's why it's such an unstable and unsteady card. And Pamela's really utilised her existing artwork as the ideal picture for this book T description of the card. And as a result, she has literally intuited the richness of Kabbalah into these cards. So when people try and make Kabbalistic correspondences with these cards, for example, I don't know, say for example in this card, looking at the symbols on the quilt or something like this, I wasn't that sort of person. She wasn't that sort of artist. She wouldn't have deliberately placed deliberate symbols on these cards. But she did understand the book T description, and then she understood her Shakespeare, so she used the best possible, the world's greatest storyteller, through the design features to the Kabbalah without actually specifically doing it, if that makes sense. She set up a resonance between the world's storyteller, the design of those stories and the artwork of those stories, to the Kabbalah, one of the world's best mystical structures, synthesized to all esotericism through the Golden Dawn. Hence why these cards are so intuitively powerful. So here we have a card then, here we have a card that is purely Shakespearean, and here we have a card that we have a picture of in Pamela's own sketches and designs. So let's take a look at another Shakespearean one that I wanted to cover whilst we're on the swords, because we have a beautiful picture for this one. If I can, in fact, I don't think it's in. That's right, it isn't in here. I'll put a picture up a bit later on of Ellen Terry as Juliet. Ellen Terry as Juliet, okay? Because you can literally superimpose Ellen Terry on this card, sitting up on this bench, on this bed, as Juliet, wearing exactly that same outfit, that same white sort of dressing nightdress. And we know absolutely that this is Juliet waking up, discovering that Romeo has taken the draught of poison. And the reason that we know this is because of the design of the card. If I read this section from Romeo and Juliet, Act 4, Scene 3, okay? So Juliet wakes and she says, "Oh, if I wake, should I not be distraught, environed with all these hideous fears, and madly play with my forefather's joints, and pluck the mangled Tybalt from his shroud, and in this rage with some kinsman's bone, as with a club, dash out my desperate brains? Oh, look, methinks I see my cousin's ghost, seeking out Romeo that did spit his body upon a rapier's point. Stay, Tybalt, stay. Romeo, 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 here's drink. I drink to thee." And then she drinks the poison. But when we look at this card, look at that quote, we can see, "And in this rage with some great kinsman's bone, as with a club, dash out my desperate brains." That is the picture that is on the bottom of this card down here. Some people have said in the past that this could be Cain and Abel, or some people say it's two foresters in the woods with some trees either side of them. But again, if you go back to what Waite envisaged and what Pamela Collins knew, then the artwork is perfectly obvious. I've got a picture which I'll load up after we've done this class, superimposing both Ellen Terry on this card, but also a picture of Cain and Abel, and they are between two funeral pyres. The actual biblical scene takes place with two funeral pyres, and the bone, the kinsman's bone, is obviously the bone that I think Cain used to slay Abel, or Abel slay Cain. I think it's the mark of Cain, isn't it? So I think Cain was the brother who killed Abel, if I've got that right. But that is that scene there. And remember the thing about upon some rapier's point? Well, Pamela made a point of not including the rapier's point. There was no reason why she couldn't have just ended each sword within the frame of the card, but she wanted to show the sorrow of Juliet, just endless sorrow, because that's what the quote means. And so this scene is just a straightforward scene from Romeo and Juliet, including the references, including the actress that Pamela was familiar with, and including the nod of the design, a bit like we saw the snail, to the rapier's point. And, if you can find some other quote that was familiar to Pamela Coleman Smith that involves Cain and Abel, a white-robed woman, and a rapier's point, then, again, be my guest. I'd love to know. And that's the thing with the research that we did. We took Occam's razor as the simplest explanation for each of the cards. Similarly, when we come to other cards, I'd like to take a look at this one before we start to make a finish for tonight, which is, just to by the by, sometimes in research you think, well, Pamela definitely drew the people around her. She had access to them as models. We know with the Queen of Wands, we got Edie Craig to sit with a sunflower and the stave from the trellis that they were building at the time, and Snuffles the cat, which we have pictures of, was by her side, and so on. But then, particularly for the Six of Swords, I kept thinking, well, she must have had them stand on a boat to draw it or something like that. But there was no boat at Small Hythe. There was no canal or river nearby. And I thought maybe at her London residence, maybe there were boats in the park opposite or something. And it wasn't until a bit later on that we found in the Victoria and Albert Museum, Charlie and I visited the Victoria and Albert Museum to look at Ellen Terry's collection of photos, to see if any had Pamela on them from 1909. But we found this one. And this is a postcard from the Small Hythe in 1909. And at the time, there was a pond with a boat. And there's the boat from the Six of Swords on it. And I don't know if you can see in the video, but that's part of the trellis work that you see all of the wands from that the characters are holding, like in the Five of Wands. So Pamela really did paint and draw into it what was around her at the time. And sometimes the research is inconclusive until you find pictures of the exact time that the people were living in, because, of course, they weren't living in the future. They were living at the time. So I just wanted to see if we've got the final picture that I wanted to show you of Oscar Ashe. Here we go. We've got a couple of Falstaff actually, but here is Oscar Ashe as Falstaff, and you can see here. So there, and there is the card. Okay, can you see his unbuttoned shirt, his big belly, his sort of self-effacing character, the hat, of course. You can see exactly the same hat. Can you see the cups behind him? What's over here? So you can see the cups behind him as well. And we can see this as a typical cabinet card as well, with a character, some props, and then this dividing line at the back to get a sense of perspective. Okay. And the reason we know that this is Falstaff on the card, other than the simple explanation of it's all Shakespeare, is this quote here from Henry IV, Part 1. And I'll hold the card up. And they're talking about Falstaff, okay? They're talking about Falstaff, this character. Thou art so fat-witted with drinking of old sack, that's the beer that's in all of these cups. Thou art so fat-witted with drinking of old sack and unbuttoning thee after supper and sleeping upon benches afternoon. You can see how he's unbuttoned, and you can see this is a bench, not a stool or a chair or throne or anything. It's definitely a bench. That thou hast forgotten to demand that truly which thou truly know. Okay, and it does go on a little bit, the quote, but that's the first part of that quote. Okay, so that's from Henry IV, Part 1, Act 1, Scene 2. And so now, whenever that card comes up in a reading, I always know that it's to do with self-satisfaction, and I always quote the quote, thou hast forgotten to ask that which thou wouldst truly wish to know. The Nine of Cups always comes up for me now for when someone isn't asking the right questions. They've literally forgotten to ask of themselves the right questions. Okay, so when we understand the sources, and then when we look at Book T, we find that this is the 9 Yesod of Bria, the cups. So it is the 9, the Yesod in the world of creativity, which is this sort of imagination part in the world of creativity, which is a great, powerful card and position on the Tree of Life, but a very dangerous one, because you can get lost in endless wishing that you were something else. Okay, have a good day, Russell. Talk to you later. So you can get very lost in this and forget why you actually went in to that particular creative ambition in the first place, or whatever it may be. So Pamela's really captured through Shakespeare, who was, probably the world's greatest character describer, relationship describer, and through her artwork, she's segued the Kabbalah with Shakespeare in the perfect marriage through these cards. And it's no wonder, therefore, to conclude my presentation of the day, my proposal that these are the longest lasting cards and the strongest designs, because no one has ever segued something as rigorous as the mystical Kabbalah to something as explanatory as Shakespeare through their artwork, through a deck. And she literally did it in 5 months with no real experience of reading tarot. She never read tarot afterwards, to our knowledge. And Waite just called it a delightful experiment. That's all he was interested in. And I just say, just going, just a brief note, someone, Ziga, had said, why particularly drawn? I haven't got the Queen of Wands out in the cards that I was going to look at today. But if you have some research, if you do a little bit of research into E.D. Craig, Edycraig, who was Pamela's friend, then the Queen of Wands is based on her character. And E.D. Craig was totally out there, totally ahead of her time. She was in a tripartite all-female relationship with 2 other women. They all took on male names, and they lived together openly, way ahead of their time. And so E.D. Craig was the ideal model with Snuffles, which was Edie Craig's cat. Someone once we put that on our Facebook group maybe 2 years ago when we were doing Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot, and within literally an hour, someone copied it onto their page to say, I've discovered that Pamela Coleman Smith's cat was called Snuffles. And it wasn't. It was actually Edie Craig's cat that was pictured in that card. And so, Ziga, if you look at Edie Craig's life, maybe there's something in her life, in the character, as to why Pamela chose her as the Queen of Wands that maybe you can identify with in some way, or has a particular message for you. Again, we do describe some of that in the book. Would encourage you to take a look at the book if you want to know where all of these symbols come from. This is Shakespearean, that is Shakespearean, that is Shakespearean, that is another play that Pamela was familiar with, that Shakespearean, that Shakespearean, that Shakespearean. Each of these cards are, it could really be called the Waite-Smith Shakespearean deck. Probably if it was being marketed nowadays, it would be called the Shakespearean Catholic Christian Redemptive Shekinah deck or something like that. But we'll come on to Waite's work as we go through this series over the next few days, because I just wanted to concentrate a bit on the Waite-Smith. Okay, Edie Craig. I'll just put that in as a comment, if I may. It's Edie Craig. Whoops. If I can spell Edie Craig, like that. Okay. And she was Ellen Terry's daughter. So Ellen Terry was a famous actress that in Slew Abel. Good, got that. Right, okay then. So we're going to read our bedtime story, and I've chosen tonight's city based on sort of where we are in our lockdowns. We're sort of in the middle, I guess. Things are looking up a little bit. It's too early to declare ourselves quite out of the pandemic yet, but we are heading that way, I hope. And so I'd like to read something about the importance maybe of telling stories, as Shakespeare was an important storyteller. Waite wanted to tell a particular mystical story, and Pamela Coleman Smith had the ability to design that story into her art. So I'm going to read about the city of Euphemia in Trading Cities, in Invisible Cities by Calvino. Proceeding 80 miles into the northwest wind, you reach the city of Euphemia, where the merchants of nations gather at every solstice and equinox. The boat that lands there with a cargo of ginger and cotton will set sail again, its hold filled with pistachio nuts and poppy seeds, and the caravan that has just unloaded sacks of nutmegs and raisins is already cramming its saddlebags with bolts of golden muslin for the return journey. But what drives men to travel up rivers and cross deserts to come here is not only the exchange of wares, which you could find everywhere the same in all of the bazaars inside and outside the great Khan's empire, scattered at your feet on the same yellow mats in the shade of the same awnings protecting them from the flies, offered with the same lying reduction in prices. You do not come to Euphemia only to buy and sell, but also because at night, by the fires all around the market, seated on sacks or barrels or stretched out on piles of carpets, at each word that one man says, such as wolf, sister, hidden treasure, battle, scabies, lovers, the others tell each one his tale of wolves, sisters, treasures, scabies, lovers, battles. And you know that in the long journey ahead of you, when to keep awake against the camels swaying or the junks rocking, you start summoning up your memories one by one. Your wolf will have become another wolf. Your sister, a different sister. Your battle, everyone else's battles. On your return from Euphemia, the city where memory is traded at every solstice and at every equinox. Isn't that a beautiful story? And it's about the importance of us gathering around a campfire to tell our own stories to each other. Okay, thank you for your time and attention. We are going to continue on with our series of tarot on sessions as the Illustrious Order of Hermits every evening, and we're going to spend a little bit more time in the Waite-Smith tarot over the next few days, and then I'm going to round that up by bringing back some of the NLP and Kabbalah into reading the Celtic Cross again with what we then know about the cards. And then we'll see where we go from there in our journeys. So thanks all for your time and attention, and stay safe, stay sane, look after each other. Bye for now.